Looking for oil in the polar region will raise scores of geopolitical issues, including who controls what parts of the Arctic, and what environmental regulations should cover the development of any oil discovered there. Aside from conventional petroleum, which can easily be pumped to the surface, vast amounts of oil are stored in tar sands, and can be produced from oil shale. The Athabasca tar sand deposits in Alberta, Canada, may total 1.8 trillion barrels. Only about 300 billion barrels of this may be recoverable, however. Venezuela also has a large deposit of extra heavy oil, estimated at 1.2 trillion barrels. Perhaps a third of it can be readily recovered. Oil shale concentrated in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah in the United States holds large quantities of kerogen, an organic material that can be converted into oil and gas. In the late 1970s, the United States launched a major effort to develop the oil shale on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. When oil prices dropped in 1982, the oil shale industry collapsed. Exxon quickly pulled out of its $5 billion Colorado project, and the remaining companies soon followed suit. Since extracting oil from shale requires several barrels of water for each barrel of oil produced, water scarcity may limit its revival. The one project that is moving ahead is the tar sands project in Canada's Alberta province. Launched in the early 1980s, it is now producing 1.4 million barrels of oil a day, enough to meet nearly 7% of current U.S. oil needs. This tar sand oil is not cheap, however, and it wreaks environmental havoc on a vast scale. Producing oil from tar sands is highly carbon intensive. Heating and extracting the oil from the sands relies on the extensive use of natural gas, production of which has already peaked in North America. As peak oil analyst Rick Hardheinberg notes, currently, 2 tons of sand must be mined in order to yield 1 barrel of oil. The net energy yield is low. Walter Youngquist notes, it takes the equivalent of 2 out of each 3 barrels of oil recovered to pay for all the energy and other costs involved in getting the oil from the oil sands. This, although these reserves of oil in tar sands and shale may be vast, gearing up for production is a costly, climate-disrupting, time-consuming process. At best, the development of tar sands and oil shale is likely only to slow the coming decline in world oil production. One of the influences on oil production in the years immediately ahead that is most difficult to measure is the emergence of what I call a depletion psychology. Once oil companies or oil exporting countries realize that output is about to peak, they will begin to think seriously about how to stretch out their remaining reserves. As it becomes clear that even a moderate cut in production can double world oil prices, the long-term value of their oil will become much clearer. The oil intensity of food modern agriculture depends heavily on the use of fossil fuels. Most tractors use gasoline or diesel fuel. Irrigation pumps use diesel fuel, natural gas, or coal-fired electricity. Fertilizer production is also energy-intensive. Natural gas is used to synthesize the basic ammonia building blocking nitrogen fertilizers. The mining, manufacture, and international transport of phosphates and potash all depend on oil. Efficiency gains can help reduce agriculture's dependence on oil. In the United States, the combined direct use of gasoline and diesel fuel in farming fell from its historical high of 7.7 billion gallons, 29.1 billion liters, in 1973 to 4.2 billion in 2005, a decline of 45%. Broadly calculated, the gallons of fuel used per ton of grain produced dropped from 33 in 1973 to 12 in 2005, an impressive decrease of 64%. One reason for this achievement was a shift to minimum and no-till cultural practices on roughly 2/5 of U.S. cropland. But while U.S. agricultural fuel use has been declining, in many developing countries it is rising as the shift from draft animals to tractors continues. A generation ago, for example, Cropland in China was tilled largely by draft animals. Today much of the ploughing is done with tractors. Fertilizer accounts for 20% of U.S. farm energy use. Worldwide, the figure may be slightly higher. As the world urbanizes, the demand for fertilizer climbs. As people migrate from rural areas to cities, it becomes more difficult to recycle the nutrients in the human waste back into the soil, requiring the use of more fertilizer. Beyond this, the growing international food trade can separate producer and consumer by thousands of miles, further disrupting the nutrient cycle. The United States, for example, exports some 80 million tons of grain per year, grain that contains large quantities of basic plant nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The ongoing export of these nutrients would slowly drain the inherent fertility from U.S. cropland if the nutrients were not replaced. Irrigation, another major energy claimant, is requiring more energy worldwide as water tables fall. In the United States, close to 19% of farm energy use is for pumping water, and in some states in India, where water tables are falling, over half of all electricity is used to pump water from wells. Some trends, such as the shift to no-tillage, are making agriculture less oil-intensive, but rising fertilizer use, the spread of farm mechanization, and falling water tables are having the opposite effect. Although attention commonly focuses on energy use on the farm, agriculture accounts for only 1/5 of the energy used in the U.S. food system. Transport, processing, packaging, marketing, and kitchen preparation of food are responsible for the rest. The U.S. food economy uses as much energy as the entire economy of the United Kingdom. The 14% of energy used in the food system to move goods from farm to consumer is equal to 2/3 of the energy used to produce the food, and an estimated 16% of food system energy use is devoted to canning, freezing, and drying food, everything from frozen orange juice concentrate to canned peas. Food staples such as wheat have traditionally moved over long distances by ship, traveling from the United States to Europe, for example. What is new is the shipment of fresh fruits and vegetables over vast distances by air. Few economic activities are more energy intensive. Food miles, the distance that food travels from producer to consumer, have risen with cheap oil. At my local supermarket in downtown Washington, D.C., the fresh grapes and mint typically come by plane from Chile, traveling almost 5,000 miles. One of the most routine long-distance movements of fresh produce is from California to the heavily populated U.S. East Coast. Most of this produce moves by refrigerated trucks. In assessing the future of long-distance produce transport, one writer observed that the days of the 3,000-mile Caesar salad may be numbered. Packaging is also surprisingly energy-intensive, accounting for 7% of food system energy use. It is not uncommon for the energy invested in packaging to exceed that in the food it 34 contains. The U.S. farmer gets about 20% of the consumer food dollar, and for some products, the figure is much lower. As one analyst has observed, an empty cereal box delivered to the grocery store would cost about the same as a full one. The most energy-intensive segment of the food chain is the kitchen. Much more energy is used to refrigerate and prepare food in the home than is used to produce it in the first place. The big energy user in the food system is the kitchen refrigerator, not the farm tractor. While oil dominates the production end of the food system, electricity dominates the consumption end. With higher energy prices, the modern food system, that evolved when oil was cheap, will not survive as it is now structured. The changing food prospect. The world grain harvest has more than tripled since 1950, climbing from 630 million to 2 billion tons. The most rapid growth came between 1950 and 1973, when the grain harvest doubled. In 23 years, farmers expanded the grain harvest by as much as during the 11,000 preceding years, from the beginning of agriculture until 1950. The mid-20th century marked an abrupt transition point in world agriculture as the frontiers of agricultural settlement largely disappeared. Prior to then, increases in the harvest came largely from expanding the cropped area, as farmers moved from valley to valley and eventually from continent to continent. Yield increases were typically so slow as to being perceptible within a human lifespan. In contrast, since 1950, 4/5 of the world grain harvest growth has come from raising land productivity, with much of the rise dependent on oil. Between 1950 and 1990, the systematic application of science to agriculture helped raise grain yields from less than 1.1 tons per hectare to close to 2.5 tons. Grain land productivity worldwide increased 2.1% a year. Since 1990, however, the rise has slowed to 1.2% a year. By 1990, most of the easy steps to raise grain yields had already been taken. The growth in land productivity since 1950 was driven by three trends: a near tripling of the world irrigated area, a tenfold growth in world fertilizer use, and the rapid dissemination of high-yielding varieties that centered on hybrid corn in the United States, and the high-yielding dwarf wheats and rices in Asia. While world grain production has expanded continuously, it has slowed in recent decades, falling below the growth in world population after 1984. As a result, grain production per person peaked in 1984 at 342 kilograms, dropping to 302 kilograms in 2006. A 12% drop in the grain harvested per person could be expected to lead to a dramatic increase in world hunger, but it did not. The number of hungry people in the world, which was greatly reduced from 1950 to 1984, continued to decline until the late 1990s before turning upward. The fall in grain production per person did not automatically translate into more hunger, because of the enormous growth in the world's soybean harvest from 68 million tons in 1984 to 222 million tons in 2007. The growing use of soybean meal, the high-protein meal left after the oil is extracted, as a supplement to grain and livestock, poultry, and fish rations both substituted for some of the grain used for feed, and greatly increased the efficiency with which the grain itself was converted into animal protein. Feed rations containing roughly 4/5 grain and 1/5 soybean meal are now standard fare in livestock, poultry, and fish feeding. This allowed the global diet to improve even as the grain supply per person was declining. Originally domesticated by farmers in central China some 5,000 years ago, the soybean now occupies a dominant position in world agriculture. The growth in soybean production has been meteoric. In both Brazil and Argentina, soybean production took off after 1980. By 2005, the soybean harvest in each country was rivaling or exceeding the grain harvest. By 1990, more U.S. land was planted to soybeans than to wheat. In the end, however, the world food prospect depends heavily on the expansion of the big three grains: wheat, rice, and corn. In 7 of the last 8 years, world grain production has fallen short of consumption, dropping world carry-over stocks of grain to the lowest level in 34 years. The world's farmers already struggling to expand fast enough to feed 70 million more people each year, and to allow billions of low-income consumers to move up the food chain, are now being further challenged by the exploding demand for grain to produce fuel ethanol for cars. Farmers are facing new constraints as they attempt to meet record growth in the demand for grain. While the irrigated area was growing throughout the last half-century, supplies of irrigation water in this new century are beginning to shrink in some countries as wells go dry, and scarce water is diverted to cities. And for the first time, harvests in large countries like China are being reduced by water shortages. This is most evident with wheat, produced mainly in the more arid northern half of China, where water tables are falling and wells are going dry. China's wheat harvest peaked in 1997 at 123 million tons and has now dropped to scarcely 100 million tons, a fall of nearly 20%. The wild card in the food prospect is climate change.